What would you do if someone looked you in the eye and said, "Your kind doesn't belong here," right as you stepped onto a plane, holding a first-class ticket you paid for? For Jonathan Carter, one of America's most respected black CEOs, those words didn't just sting, they ignited a storm that no airline could have prepared for. 20 years of success, billions in deals closed, and still, in a single moment, he was reduced to nothing more than the color of his skin. But here's the question. What happens when the man they try to humiliate isn't just any passenger, but someone with the power, the will, and the platform to fight back? What unfolds next will shake boardrooms, crash stock prices, and force an entire industry to face truths it has long tried to bury. This isn't just about one seat, one flight, or one insult. It's about a reckoning that changes everything. So, stay with us because you won't believe how this story ends. And before we dive in, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the powerful stories we bring to light every week. The cabin lights glowed a soft amber, casting a calm over passengers settling into their leather seats. Flight attendants moved with brisk efficiency, tucking bags overhead, checking belts, offering practiced smiles that barely touched their eyes. First class carried its usual quiet hum of privilege, laptops opening, shoes being loosened, champagne flutes already clinking with a delicate fizz. And then came the words, "Your kind doesn't belong in first class." The sentence did not ring out loudly, but it landed with the sharpness of a blade. It cut through the calm atmosphere like a needle dragging across vinyl. Jonathan Carter froze mid-movement, boarding pass still clenched in his hand, the thin slip of paper crumpling under the force of his grip. For a second, the sound of air vents and the clatter of buckles faded. His mind caught only those words, looping them again and again, each repetition digging deeper. He had heard worse in his life. He had endured more blatant insults on playgrounds and in boardrooms. But there was something about the setting, the luxury cabin, the sterile professionalism of an airline, the silence of the other passengers that made the remark feel heavier, crueler. Here, 30,000 feet of sky would soon separate him from the ground, and already dignity was being stripped from him. Jonathan turned, slow and deliberate, to face the source. Standing in the narrow aisle, blocking his way with folded arms, was the lead flight attendant. Her name tag, tilted just enough to make reading difficult, glinted under the light Rebecca Miles. Her tone carried no shame, only the crisp authority of someone who believed procedure was on her side. "There must be a mistake," Jonathan said evenly, his voice firm yet calm. "I'm in seat 2A. He held up the pass, the letters printed in bold. He refused to let his voice tremble. Years of corporate meetings had taught him that tremor was read as weakness and raised volume as aggression. A black man's anger was never taken as righteous. It was always interpreted as dangerous. Rebecca's painted nails tapped against the screen of her handheld device with exaggerated force. "Sir, the system doesn't list you here. Please step aside while I help other passengers." Her eyes did not meet his. They darted past him to the line forming behind, as though his very presence were an inconvenience to the smooth flow of her morning. Jonathan straightened his back. 6'2", broad-shouldered from years of disciplined workouts. His presence alone filled the small aisle, but he kept his posture measured, his movements slow. Inside, his chest burned with heat, a storm gathering force. He forced his breaths into rhythm, counting silently. Appear steady, appear calm, appear safe. How many times had he coached himself this way? How many rooms had he entered knowing that his very existence came with a burden of projection? From behind, a voice interjected. Maybe he just doesn't understand how these things work. A chuckle followed, smug and dismissive. Jonathan glanced back. A white man in his 60s, salt and pepper hair carefully combed back, watched with the satisfaction of someone confident the system favored him. His boarding pass peeked from his jacket pocket. Edward Grant. The kind of man Jonathan had encountered his entire career, the self-appointed arbiter of order, the comfortable skeptic of black competence. Jonathan ignored him, focusing again on Rebecca. "Ma'am," he said, pressing the boarding pass flat on the counter built into the seat divider. His platinum watch gleamed under the overhead light, a silent testament to decades of success, though invisible to the one person who refused to see it. "I'm not mistaken. I'm in seat 2O. You can scan it again?" Rebecca's nostrils flared, her jaw tightening as if the challenge itself offended her. She glanced down, pretended to type again, and shook her head. "It must be a glitch. You'll have to wait until we sort it out. Please step into the aisle so Mr. Grant can be seated." Jonathan felt dozens of eyes watching, some openly, some behind the subtle veil of lowered phones angled toward him. The air thickened. He could almost hear the calculations forming in each mind. Would he argue? Would he raise his voice? Would he become that man in first class? The viral video, the whispers, the headlines, he could already see them written, but he refused to move. Slowly, deliberately. He set his leather briefcase down by his feet. He placed his hand flat against the headrest, leaning just enough to hold his ground without blocking the aisle completely. "No," he said, his voice a calm blade. "You'll help me now?" Something flickered across Rebecca's face. Uncertainty, quickly masked by indignation. She turned sharply toward the galley. "Captain, I need assistance," she called, her tone pitched high with performative alarm. "We have a situation." The word stung situation. Jonathan clenched his jaw, holding back the bitter laugh that tried to rise. A situation. That was what he had always been. Wasn't it? Not a man, not a customer, not a CEO with a net worth in the hundreds of millions. A situation, a problem, an obstacle to the comfort of others. From his seat, Edward Grant muttered loudly enough to be heard, "Some people just can't handle rules." His wife nudged his arm, whispering for him to stop, but he leaned back smugly, satisfied with the role of commentator. Jonathan closed his eyes for a brief second, steadying himself. Behind his eyelids flickered memories the South Detroit playground, where a boy twice his size had called him names before shoving him into the dirt. The boardroom where venture capitalists asked if there was a real founder behind his company. The luxury boutique where a security guard followed him down every aisle. And now, on a plane, he had paid full fare to board. The same tired narrative was unfolding again. He opened his eyes, calm, controlled, deliberate. He would not give them the satisfaction of fulfilling their script. "Ma'am," he repeated, his tone unwavering. "Call whoever you need, but I am not leaving this seat." The aisle quieted to silence, broken only by the distant hum of engines preparing for departure. Passengers leaned closer in their seats, tension crackling through the cabin like static before a storm. A story was about to unfold, one that none of them expected when they sipped their champagne and opened their laptops moments earlier. And Jonathan Carter, who had built an empire from persistence and grit, knew deep in his bones that this moment would not end quietly. Jonathan Carter had perfected the art of appearing unshaken. It was a skill honed not by choice, but by necessity, built over decades of walking into rooms where his presence was questioned, before a word left his lips. In those rooms, board members and investors scanned him with raised brows, searching for flaws, calculating risks. A black man at the head of a billion-dollar technology firm was still, in 2025, something many could not reconcile. So Jonathan had taught himself a discipline few could match. He moved with precision, spoke with measured cadence, and wore restraint like a second skin. But calmness, he knew, always came at a cost. Beneath the surface, the weight was constant. It pressed against his chest like a stone. And sitting in that airplane cabin, accused of taking a seat that rightfully belonged to him, the stone felt heavier than it had in years. His mind drifted back, as it often did in moments of confrontation, to where it all began. Detroit, 1970s. A cramped apartment where the smell of his mother's cooking filled the air, where the sound of sirens outside was more frequent than laughter inside. His father, Daniel Carter, worked 2 jobs at the auto plant, his hands thick with calluses, his back bent before he was 40. Jonathan had been 12 when his father collapsed at the kitchen table, his heart giving out after years of labor without rest. He remembered his mother's scream, sharp and piercing, a sound that lived inside him even now. From that day, Jonathan swore 2 things: that he would escape the cycle that had claimed his father, and that he would carry his family's name into places no one believed it belonged. He studied relentlessly, chasing scholarships, skipping teenage indulgences. While friends lingered on street corners or slipped into trouble, Jonathan sat hunched over library tables, eyes burning from late-night reading under flickering fluorescent lights. He earned his way into the University of Michigan, and later MIT, by sheer force of will. There were no connections to smooth the path, no family wealth to fall back on, only determination that felt as unyielding as steel. Those years hardened him, but they also carved him into something else, a man who understood that every success would be contested. In Silicon Valley, when he founded his company, the investors didn't see potential in the young black engineer with sharp suits and sharper ideas. They spoke over him, deferred to his white co-founder, acted as if Jonathan were simply a front for someone else's vision. He learned then what he already knew as a boy in Detroit. Dignity had to be defended at every step, and so he became calm. Not because he lacked fire, but because fire needed control. He taught himself the art of measured pauses in conversations, the value of silence before a decisive word. He learned how to fix his expression into one of unflappable composure, even when insults seared beneath the surface. Calmness became his armor, a shield against the stereotypes that stalked him in every boardroom. It was also the armor he wore for Leah. His daughter had grown up in a different world than the one that raised him. Where Jonathan had seen gunfire in alleys, Leah saw ballet recitals and science fairs. Where he had worried about surviving until 18, she worried about grades in biology and interviews for medical school. He had built that world for her. Every sleepless night, every grueling negotiation, every soul-crushing encounter with bias was endured for the purpose of giving her a life where possibilities stretched as wide as the horizon. Still, Jonathan knew that no amount of success could shield her completely. He remembered the first time Leah came home from elementary school, tears streaking her cheeks, asking why another girl had said her hair looked wrong. He remembered kneeling beside her, brushing curls from her face, and saying the words that would echo between them for years. From struggle comes purpose. It was not just comfort, it was a creed. Now Leah was 24, in her second year of medical school at Columbia, brilliant and relentless in her own right. She texted him almost every morning, reminding him to take his blood pressure medication, asking about his schedule, slipping in small encouragements disguised as casual words. She was his compass, his grounding force. As the cabin buzzed with quiet tension, Jonathan thought of her again. What would Leah say if she were here, watching her father stand accused of not belonging where he had worked a lifetime to arrive? She would tell him what she always did. Don't let them make you small. And yet the calculation was never simple. He carried more than his own dignity on his shoulders. He carried the responsibility of knowing that every action of his, every word, would be dissected, replayed, interpreted not just as Jonathan Carter's choice, but as a reflection of black men everywhere. That was the exhausting paradox. To defend himself was to risk being painted as aggressive. To step back was to confirm assumptions of inferiority. Either way, the narrative was rigged against him. Jonathan exhaled, long and slow, forcing his pulse to steady. This was the life he had chosen, the life he had built. But moments like this revealed the cost. It was never just about him. It was about the world his daughter would inherit, the world he refused to accept as fixed. Around him, the passengers shuffled uneasily. Some avoided eye contact, burying themselves in magazines and tablets. Others leaned ever so slightly closer, hungry for drama, eyes bright with the thrill of a spectacle. He could sense the glow of phone screens as they recorded, the subtle tilt of cameras capturing his every breath. He was no longer just a man on a plane. He was becoming a headline, a clip, a story. And Jonathan understood something then. This was not only another insult to absorb. It was a moment that demanded choice. To remain silent would be easier. It would let the flight continue, the passengers relax, the airline save face. But silence had been his companion too many times. Silence had not protected his father. Silence had not kept Leah from facing cruelty on a playground. Silence had never dismantled the invisible walls built around him. Calmness was his armor, but calmness without action was surrender. He would need to be both steady and unyielding, measured yet defiant. Jonathan's eyes fell again on Rebecca Miles, who stood stiffly with her device clutched like a weapon, refusing to acknowledge the evidence in his hand. He studied her carefully. She was not the first gatekeeper he had faced. She would not be the last. But the power she wielded in this cabin, the authority she claimed over his place in it, carried the weight of an entire system behind her. His gaze shifted briefly to Edward Grant, still smirking from his seat, convinced he was witnessing a disruption caused by someone out of place. Jonathan did not need to hear Edward's thoughts to know them. He had encountered that look too many times, the quiet satisfaction of superiority, the assurance that rules and order always bent toward men like him. Jonathan straightened, squaring his shoulders. Calmness, yes, but calmness with resolve. He was not a boy from Detroit anymore, waiting for permission to exist. He was not a founder begging for capital from investors who doubted his worth. He was not a father telling his daughter to hold her head high while he swallowed humiliation in silence. He was Jonathan Carter, and this seat, this fight, this moment belonged to him as much as to anyone else. Somewhere in the back of the cabin, he heard a phone notification ping, then another. News traveled fast. Stories spread even faster. And Jonathan, though he did not yet know it, was standing on the edge of something larger than himself, a storm about to break. He breathed in once more, let the air fill his chest, and allowed calmness to cloak him again. But this time, beneath it, he carried something sharper, something stronger, the unshakable decision that he would not let this pass quietly. Jonathan remained standing in the narrow aisle, his tall frame casting a quiet authority over the space. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the rustling of seat belts and the faint hiss of air through the vents. Rebecca Miles held her device tightly, her knuckles pale, as if gripping not just a piece of equipment, but the authority of the airline itself. "Sir," she said, her voice sharpened now, as if speaking to a disobedient child, "I've asked you to step aside. You are holding up the boarding process." Jonathan didn't flinch. He simply lifted his boarding pass again, letting the bold print gleam beneath the cabin lights. "This says seat 2A. It is valid. I have paid for it. I will sit here." His words carried steady weight, the kind that belonged to a man accustomed to commanding attention without raising his voice. Rebecca's lips tightened. Her eyes darted to the line of passengers still waiting to pass. Her frustration was no longer just with Jonathan, but with the witnesses who were growing restless. Authority worked best in silence. Confrontation in front of an audience was something else entirely. "System shows differently," she muttered, refusing eye contact. Then, louder, so others could hear, "He's not listed for this seat." A murmur rippled through the cabin. Heads turned, eyes flicked between Jonathan and Rebecca. Phones lifted higher, screens glowing discreetly at angles that betrayed recording. Jonathan could sense it, the modern reality that every confrontation became potential evidence, potential spectacle. Behind him, Edward Grant cleared his throat theatrically, leaning forward just enough to insert himself. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said in a voice that carried more than it needed to. "I'm sure this gentleman is mistaken. These booking systems can be confusing." His words dripped with the casual superiority of someone who never once in his life doubted his place. Jonathan turned slowly, locking eyes with Edward. The older man met his gaze with practiced indifference, the look of someone who thought he was simply stating common sense. Jonathan let the silence hang, long enough for Edward's confidence to falter. Then, measured and deliberate, he said, "I am not mistaken." His tone was low but resonant, carrying across the rows. "I know how these systems work because I've flown over 3 million miles in the last 20 years. I know exactly where I belong." The weight of those words pressed into the cabin. For the first time, Edward shifted uncomfortably, his smirk fading into something closer to irritation. But before he could reply, Rebecca straightened, raising her chin. "Sir, you are becoming disruptive," she declared, her voice climbing in pitch. "If you refuse to cooperate, I will have no choice but to contact security." Jonathan's jaw tightened. Disruptive. That word again. Always the word. A way to shift the story, to erase the injustice and replace it with accusation. He had been called disruptive when he asked why his company was overlooked for a contract. He had been called disruptive when he refused to allow a venture capitalist to address only his white colleague. And now, on this plane, standing in front of the seat he had purchased, he was being cast as the problem. A young woman across the aisle whispered, "This is wrong," to her companion, her phone angled toward Jonathan. Others sat frozen, unwilling to voice anything, content to watch and record. The cabin had become a theater, each passenger an audience member, waiting to see how the scene would unfold. Jonathan leaned closer to Rebecca, not threatening, but close enough to make his words private and inescapable. "Call whoever you need, but I will not move." For the first time. Rebecca's mask cracked. A flicker of uncertainty passed across her features. Her authority was not absolute anymore. The room was not silent. It was recording. And in that space, doubt slipped into her tone. Still, she straightened again, forcing her voice into sternness. "I'll get the captain." Jonathan stepped aside slightly, just enough to let another passenger pass into their seat, but not enough to surrender his position. He lowered himself slowly into 2A, the leather creaking beneath him. He placed the boarding pass on the tray table in front of him like evidence in plain sight. Edward leaned across the aisle, his face flushed. "You know," he said, voice thick with disdain, "if you just sat down somewhere else, none of this would be happening. You're making it worse for yourself." Jonathan turned his head, meeting his eyes with steady calm. "I am exactly where I belong. What's happening is not because of me. It's because of her decision to deny what is right in front of her." His words were firm, but even, the controlled cadence of a man refusing to play into the caricature expected of him. Edward snorted, shaking his head, and muttered under his breath. Always looking for trouble, Jonathan's chest burned, but he swallowed the fire. Anger was a currency too costly to spend here. He closed his eyes briefly, picturing Leah's face, her wide, bright smile, the day she got her acceptance letter into medical school, the way she hugged him tightly, whispering, "See, Dad, you told me we could do anything." That memory steadied him, like an anchor cast into turbulent waters. The front of the cabin stirred as Rebecca returned, accompanied by a tall, broad-shouldered figure in the Navy uniform of authority, Captain Harold Green. His hair was peppered with gray, his presence commanding not just because of the stripes on his shoulders, but because of the calm weight in his gaze. As he approached, Jonathan caught it, the brief flicker of recognition, the unspoken acknowledgement exchanged between two black men navigating spaces where they were never expected to belong. "Mr. Carter," Captain Green asked, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp. Jonathan nodded once, keeping his voice steady. "Yes." "Captain, I am in my assigned seat. 2A. The boarding pass is right here. Your flight attendant insists otherwise." Rebecca jumped in, her words tumbling quickly. "The system showed it was taken. He refused to move. He's being aggressive." Green raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "Aggressive." His gaze flicked to Jonathan, then back to Rebecca. "I don't see aggression. I see a passenger seated in his seat." Rebecca faltered, lips parting as if to argue, but Green's eyes held hers with quiet authority. The power dynamic shifted in that instant, though no one moved. Jonathan inhaled slowly. He recognized the captain's intervention for what it was, a lifeline, subtle but unmistakable. Still, the tension lingered. Rebecca was not backing down fully. Edward was still muttering in his seat. And the eyes of the cabin remained glued to the unfolding scene. Jonathan leaned back against the headrest, his posture relaxed but his mind racing. He had stood his ground, but the battle was not over. This was only the beginning. The storm outside had yet to break, and somewhere in his chest, Jonathan knew it would not remain contained within the walls of this cabin. The cabin door shut with a solid thud, signaling final boarding. The engines hummed louder. The plane was preparing for takeoff. But for Jonathan, the flight had already taken him into turbulence, one that no autopilot could navigate. The engines roared to life beneath the cabin floor, a low vibration humming through the seats as the aircraft prepared to push back from the gate. The passengers settled into uneasy silence. Conversations that had bubbled moments ago were now muted, replaced by the weight of tension hanging heavy in the air. Jonathan Carter remained in seat 2A, his posture straight, his expression calm but unreadable. He could feel eyes on him, some curious, others annoyed, a few quietly sympathetic. But among them, one gaze lingered not with judgment or indifference, but with something else, recognition. Alicia Brown moved down the aisle with practiced grace, offering assistance to passengers stowing last-minute bags. Her uniform was crisp, her hair pulled neatly into a bun, but her eyes carried a softness that betrayed her thoughts. She was in her early 30s, 5 years into her career with the airline, and though she had learned to keep her tone professional and her demeanor controlled, inside she wrestled with a constant truth. She knew what she was witnessing because she had lived it herself. As she approached Jonathan's row, her steps slowed. She adjusted a bag in the overhead bin, lingering just a second longer than necessary, giving herself the excuse to stay within earshot. Her eyes flicked to Rebecca Miles, who stood near the galley, arms folded tightly, her expression frozen in a mask of wounded authority. Alicia had seen that look before. Rebecca carried herself like someone who relished control, who enforced rules more harshly on some passengers than others, and Alicia, quietly, had lost count of the times she'd been called aside by coworkers, whispering stories about difficult flyers who just so happened to share her skin tone. She bent slightly toward Jonathan, her voice low, barely audible over the hum of the engines. "You're not mistaken," she whispered. "That seat is yours." Jonathan turned his head just enough to meet her eyes. For the first time since the confrontation began, he saw something besides hostility or curiosity in another's gaze. He saw honesty. He saw a quiet ally. "Thank you," he murmured. Her throat tightened. She wanted to say more, to tell him she had watched Rebecca pull stunts like this before, to admit that other black passengers had been quietly shuffled to lesser seats or questioned unnecessarily, but fear coiled in her chest. Jobs in this industry were not easy to come by, and speaking against a senior attendant could cost her everything. Still, she couldn't stay completely silent. "She has a reputation," Alicia said softly, her eyes darting toward Rebecca. "Among crew. We all know. You're not the first." Jonathan's jaw tightened, but his expression did not shift. He simply nodded once, absorbing the confirmation of what he already suspected. It was never an isolated incident. It was always a pattern. The announcement crackled overhead as the captain's voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Green. We'll be departing shortly. Please take your seats and prepare for takeoff." Passengers fastened belts. Screens glowed with the safety demonstration, but beneath the ritual of departure, the energy remained charged. Jonathan sensed it in the way people shifted in their seats, in the sideways glances cast his way, in the subtle tilt of phones still recording. Rebecca approached again, her smile brittle, her voice coated with artificial sweetness. "Mr. Carter, once we're in the air, I'll see if we can sort this out more properly. For now, please remain seated." Jonathan met her gaze evenly. "I intend to." Her lips pressed thin, irritation flashing before she turned away. Alicia caught the flicker and felt her stomach twist. She had been right. Rebecca wasn't finished. Jonathan leaned back, forcing his body into stillness. Inside, however, his mind was anything but calm. He thought again of Leah, her words echoing like a mantra. "Don't let them make you small." Yet the calculation pressed against him, the same calculation he'd made countless times before. If he pushed too far, security could be summoned again. And he knew exactly how men like Officer Collins, the younger one who'd appeared earlier at the gate, would read his stature, his voice, his skin. A threat. Always a threat. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself. Patience was survival, but silence was complicity. The plane began to taxi, its nose turning toward the runway. Jonathan's fingers tapped lightly against the armrest, the only sign of the storm within. He studied the passengers around him. Edward Grant sat across the aisle, shifting uncomfortably now, though still wearing an air of smugness. 2 rows back, a young man angled his phone deliberately, eyes darting between the screen and Jonathan. Near the bulkhead, an older black couple exchanged quiet glances, their expressions heavy with the familiarity of what they were watching. The injustice was no longer contained to Jonathan's seat. It had become a spectacle for the cabin, an event that passengers would later recount over dinners and text messages. For some, it would be entertainment. For others, an uncomfortable truth they would try to bury. But for Jonathan, it was fuel. As the plane lifted into the air, pressing passengers back against their seats, Alicia moved quietly through the cabin, checking belts, adjusting headrests. When she passed Jonathan again, she paused, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "You should document this," she whispered. "Every word, every name." Jonathan gave a small nod. He already had. His phone sat in his lap, Notes app open, names typed carefully. Rebecca Miles, Captain Harold Green, Edward Grant, timestamps, exact phrases. He had learned long ago that memory could be dismissed as unreliable, but documentation endured. When Alicia moved on, Jonathan allowed himself the briefest moment of reflection. He thought of all the files he had compiled over the years, incidents in hotels, at conferences, in restaurants, each one a scar written down, preserved like evidence in a case that never seemed to reach trial. And yet, perhaps this one would. Perhaps this time, the documentation would not vanish into silence. The seatbelt sign dinged off. Rebecca emerged again, beginning the ritual of first-class service, but her movements were stiff, her smile tighter than ever. She avoided Jonathan's row for as long as possible, tending to Edward and his wife, pouring their bourbon with exaggerated care. Edward lifted his glass with a smirk, clearly enjoying the performance. Finally, Rebecca turned toward Jonathan, tray balanced perfectly in her manicured hands. "Something to drink, Mr. Carter?" she asked, her tone a parody of politeness. Jonathan looked at her, his face expressionless. "Water. That will be fine." Her lips twitched, as if she wanted to say more, but she poured the glass and set it down, retreating quickly toward the galley. Alicia watched from the corner of her eye, her chest tight. She wanted to intervene more openly, to shield him from the quiet malice radiating from her colleague. But she held her tongue, waiting for her moment. Jonathan sipped the water slowly, every movement deliberate. He felt the burn of Edward's gaze on him, the weight of the other passengers' curiosity. But more than anything, he felt the resolve hardening within him. He had endured this too many times. This wasn't just about a seat. This was about something larger, something systemic. He set the glass down carefully, his reflection faint in the surface of the liquid. Calmness was his armor, but resolve that was his weapon. And in the quiet acknowledgment from Alicia Brown, the subtle support of Captain Green, and the silent witness of countless eyes in the cabin, Jonathan understood something vital. He was no longer alone in this fight. Jonathan Carter sat in seat 2A with his back straight, his hands resting calmly on the armrests. But inside, his thoughts collided like waves in a storm. The glass of water in front of him reflected the cabin lights, still and clear, a sharp contrast to the turmoil beneath his controlled exterior. He had learned long ago how to mask the storm. Calmness was survival. Composure was armor. Yet even armor grew heavy after decades of wearing it. As the plane leveled at cruising altitude, The cabin settled into its routines. Flight attendants moved gracefully down the aisles. The low murmur of passengers resumed. Screens flickered with movies. And yet Jonathan remained hyper-aware of every glance that landed on him. He could feel them like pinpricks, Edward Grant's smug looks across the aisle, Rebecca's thinly veiled irritation, the quiet sympathy in Alicia's passing glances. But the sharpest weight wasn't in the present moment. It was in the memories pressing forward from the past. Jonathan remembered the boardroom in New York, years earlier, when he had pitched next course security for the first time. The technology was flawless, his slides crisp, his argument airtight. Yet when the investors asked questions, they didn't direct them to him. They turned to his white co-founder, a man who owned 20% of the company compared to Jonathan's 51%. Jonathan had sat there, answering politely when called upon, while rage burned behind his polite smile. He had won that round, eventually secured the investment, and built the company. But the scar of that humiliation never left him. He remembered the boutique in San Francisco, where he had wandered into a luxury watch store, already wearing a timepiece that cost more than most people's cars. The security guard trailed behind him, step for step, until Jonathan finally asked if there was something he could help with. The man's face flushed, muttering about policy. Jonathan had left without buying anything, dignity preserved but spirit bruised. And he remembered the night Leah, then 10 years old, asked him if she was ugly. She had come home from school with tears in her eyes, saying another girl told her that her hair was messy and that her skin looked dirty. Jonathan had sat her down on his lap, wiping her cheeks, telling her over and over that she was beautiful, that her curls were crowns, that her skin was radiant. But when she went to sleep, he had sat awake, staring at the ceiling, fury and sorrow tearing him apart. Now, in this airplane cabin, those memories returned like ghosts, each one whispering the same truth. This was never just about a seat, or a boarding pass, or a glitch. It was about the relentless grind of being doubted, dismissed, diminished no matter the success, no matter the wealth, no matter the titles earned. He glanced across the aisle again. Edward had pulled out a tablet, pretending to read, but sneaking glances at Jonathan as though expecting him to erupt. The assumption was obvious. They were all waiting for him to slip, to lose his composure, to confirm their silent stereotypes. Jonathan breathed slowly, deliberately, in through the nose, hold for 4 counts, out through the mouth. He had mastered this exercise years ago, before stepping onto stages with thousands of eyes fixed on him, before negotiating billion-dollar deals under the weight of skepticism. Breathing steadied him. Breathing reminded him of control. Still, the inner battle raged. Part of him wanted to stand up, to confront Rebecca openly, to let his voice rise so every passenger knew the truth of what had just happened, to demand respect, to refuse to swallow indignity yet again. But another part warned caution. He thought of Leah's face, imagined her scrolling through social media and seeing a video of her father escorted off a plane by armed officers. He imagined the headlines, the whispers, disruptive passenger, aggressive behavior, unstable executive. It didn't matter that the truth would be different. It never mattered. Perception carried more weight than fact, especially for men like him. That calculation gnawed at him. Dignity versus survival. Speak versus swallow. Resist versus retreat. The equation never grew easier with time. If anything, it grew heavier. He closed his eyes for a moment. Behind his lids, he saw his father again, Daniel Carter, broad-shouldered and weary, coming home from the factory smelling of sweat and steel. His father never had the chance to fight battles like these. Poverty left no room for defiance. But Jonathan remembered the day his father told him, "Son, never let the world tell you where you don't belong. You walk in like you own it, even when they say you don't." Those words had carried him through countless doors. And yet here, thousands of feet above the earth, a flight attendant had tried to bar him once more. Jonathan opened his eyes. His jaw was tight, but his voice, when he finally spoke to himself, was steady. "Not today." He reached for his phone, thumbs tapping quietly against the screen. He wrote down everything the time Rebecca had confronted him, the exact words she used, the witnesses around him, the names he had gathered. He typed with precision, as if building a case file. Each entry steadied him further. Documentation was not just protection, it was power. Alicia passed by again, pausing just briefly enough to catch his eye. She didn't speak this time. She didn't need to. Her look said, "What words couldn't I see you? You are not alone." That silent support gave Jonathan a flicker of strength. For too long, these moments had been endured in isolation, swallowed quietly to protect careers, reputations, opportunities. But now, with phones recording, with witnesses watching, with an ally standing just feet away, the balance felt different. And still, doubt gnawed at him. He wrestled with questions that refused to quiet. Was he making it worse for himself? Would this overshadow the meeting waiting for him in Los Angeles? The one that could redefine the future of his company? Would this incident become a distraction, a stain on the legacy he had built brick by brick? He looked again at the reflection in the water glass. 55 years of life stared back at him. Silver threaded through his hair, lines carved deep around his eyes. Success etched into his resume, but scars etched into his soul. And he thought, maybe for the first time in a long while, what if the point was not to protect his legacy, but to use it? He had the power now, the wealth, the influence. He had built something larger than himself. Maybe this wasn't just another indignity to swallow. Maybe this was the moment his father's words demanded. Jonathan leaned back, exhaling slowly. Calm on the surface, storm beneath. For now, he would wait. But the decision was crystallizing. He would not let this vanish into silence. Not this time. The engines hummed steadily. The plane soared westward. And Jonathan Carter, seated firmly in 2A, resolved that from this inner battle would come not surrender, but purpose. The cabin had settled into a fragile rhythm. Drinks clinked on trays. A child somewhere in economy laughed too loudly, and the steady hum of the engines carried everyone westward. Yet the peace was thin, stretched like glass that could shatter with a single touch. Jonathan felt it. Everyone did. He had been patient, measured, disciplined. He had documented every word. He had kept his composure while humiliation lingered in the air like smoke. But the air around him was heavy, and he knew this story wasn't finished. Rebecca Miles returned once more, striding down the aisle with clipped steps. The smile she wore now was sharper than glass, her professionalism polished to the point of parody. She stopped at Jonathan's row, tray in hand, her voice pitched just high enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Mr. Carter," she said, her tone syrupy, "it seems we may still have a problem with your ticket. I'm going to ask you one last time. Please move to an available seat so we can avoid further complications." Jonathan looked at her, calm but unwavering. "There is no problem with my ticket. I am in my assigned seat. This conversation should be over." Rebecca's eyes flickered. irritation breaking through her mask. "Sir, if you refuse to comply, I'll have to escalate this further." The word escalate struck like a spark in dry brush. Across the aisle, Edward Grant leaned in again, his voice full of mock sympathy. "Look, man, just listen to her. It's not worth all this drama. People like us know when to pick our battles." The phrase landed like a slap. People like us. Jonathan turned his head slowly, fixing Edward with a stare so steady it forced him to shift in his seat. "People like us," Jonathan repeated, his voice low but carrying. "Tell me, Mr. Grant, what exactly do you mean by that?" Edward faltered, then tried to recover. "I mean professionals, businessmen. We know how the system works." Jonathan leaned forward slightly, his calm sharper than any shout. "No? You don't mean professionals. You don't mean businessmen. You mean men who look like you." The words rippled through the cabin. Passengers froze, caught between discomfort and fascination. Phones tilted higher, recording openly now. The confrontation was no longer just a dispute over a seat. It had become a mirror reflecting something larger. Rebecca bristled, her authority slipping. "Mr. Carter, that's enough. If you continue this behavior, I will have to." Jonathan raised a hand, cutting her off. His voice rose for the first time, not in anger, but in clarity, carrying through the cabin with the weight of command. "What behavior?" he demanded. "Sitting in the seat I purchased, showing you proof of my boarding pass, asking to be treated with the same respect as every other passenger in this cabin. Which part of that is a problem? Ms. Miles?" The silence that followed was electric. Even the child in economy had gone quiet. Rebecca's face flushed, her lips trembling with words she couldn't quite form. Authority was slipping from her grasp, unraveling thread by thread. She glanced at Edward, perhaps hoping for support, but even he seemed shaken, his smugness replaced by unease. Jonathan felt the heat in his chest, the storm that had been building since the gate now cresting inside him. For years he had swallowed these moments, buried them under professionalism, disguised them with calm, but not this time. He rose slowly from his seat, unfolding his tall frame until he stood in the aisle. Gas rippled through the cabin. A man standing in defiance, his posture commanding, his presence undeniable. Jonathan's voice remained steady, but it carried the resonance of someone who had spent decades being told no and had chosen, at last, to say yes to himself. "Everyone here has watched what happened," he said, sweeping his gaze across the cabin. "You saw me show my boarding pass. You saw me sit in the seat I purchased. And you saw this flight attendant question my right to be here again and again." He paused, letting the silence hang. Phones captured every word, every breath. "This isn't about a glitch in the system," he continued. "It's about a system that always seems to glitch when someone like me is involved." A murmur spread through the rows. Some nodded subtly. Others avoided his eyes. But the truth had been spoken, and it lingered in the air like a bell that couldn't be unrung. Rebecca's composure shattered. "This is inappropriate," she snapped. "You're disrupting the flight." Jonathan turned to her, calm as steel. "No, Ms. Miles, I am not disrupting anything. I am telling the truth. There's a difference." From the back of the cabin, Alicia Brown stepped forward. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her voice carried steady. "He's right," she said. Her eyes locked on Rebecca. "Seat 2A was his. I saw the boarding pass myself." The words hit like a thunderclap. For the first time, someone from within the crew had spoken aloud. The power dynamic shifted in an instant. Passengers leaned forward, whispering, their phones recording with renewed urgency. Rebecca's mouth opened, but no words came. She stared at Alicia, shock and betrayal flashing across her face. Jonathan turned to Alicia, giving her a single nod of gratitude. It was enough. Captain Harold Green appeared again from the cockpit, his voice calm but firm. "That's enough," he said, his presence commanding silence. "Mr. Carter is in his assigned seat. This discussion ends here." His eyes cut toward Rebecca, sharp and unyielding. "Do I make myself clear?" Rebecca froze, then muttered, "Yes, Captain," before retreating toward the galley, her face pale. Jonathan lowered himself back into 2A, his breathing steady but his pulse still racing. He had not raised his voice. He had not shouted. But for the first time in a long time, he had stood fully, visibly, undeniably in his truth. The cabin was quiet now, but it was not the same silence as before. It was charged, alive, buzzing with the knowledge that something important had just happened. Jonathan closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. For once, he felt no regret for speaking. The cost would come, as it always did, but so would the purpose. And in that moment, he knew the breaking point had passed. There was no going back. The cabin hummed with a strange energy, the kind that lingered after lightning cracked across a dark sky. Passengers shifted in their seats, whispering quietly. The glow of phones bright in their hands. The confrontation that had unfolded wasn't just an inconvenience anymore. It had become a spectacle, something raw, unsettling, unforgettable. Jonathan Carter sat back in 2A, calm on the outside, but every nerve in his body was still lit with fire. He felt the weight of dozens of eyes, the unspoken questions rippling through the cabin. Who was right? Who was wrong? What would happen next? Across the aisle. Edward Grant shook his head, muttering just loud enough for people nearby to hear. Always has to make it about race. Always. Jonathan turned his head slowly. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silence of his stare said more than words could. Edward looked away first, fumbling with the magazine in front of him, though his flushed cheeks betrayed the sting of the moment. From the galley, Rebecca Miles reappeared, her face stiff, her steps clipped. She scanned the rows like a general surveying a battlefield, her authority dented but not destroyed. She was not used to being challenged, certainly not in front of a cabin full of passengers. Her pride demanded retaliation. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice pitched higher than normal, "we apologize for any disturbance earlier. We'll be continuing service shortly." The words were professional, but the tone was brittle, defensive. Passengers exchanged glances, reading between the lines. They knew who she was talking about. They had seen what happened, and the phones kept recording. Jonathan folded his hands neatly in his lap, his expression composed. He was not going to give her the satisfaction of another exchange. Not yet. It was Alicia Brown who broke the tension. She moved calmly down the aisle, a tray balanced gracefully in her hands, but her eyes held fire. She stopped at Jonathan's row, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "You're not alone," she said softly. Jonathan studied her face for a moment. In her eyes, he saw not pity, not fear, but resolve. Quiet resolve, the kind born from years of watching and enduring. He gave a small nod. When Alicia straightened again, her voice carried louder this time, intentionally within earshot of the nearest passengers. "Mr. Carter, would you like me to bring you anything else? We want to make sure you're comfortable in your assigned seat. The choice of words, assigned seat, was deliberate. Passengers caught it. Murmurs spread again. Rebecca froze mid-step, her jaw tightening. Jonathan allowed himself the faintest smile. It wasn't victory. Not yet. But it was something. 2 rows back. A young man with thick glasses and a nervous expression raised his phone slightly higher. He cleared his throat, then spoke, his voice uncertain but firm. "Excuse me. I recorded the boarding." I saw him show his ticket. It said, "Two-way. Clear as day." Heads turned toward him. His face reddened under the attention, but he held the phone steady, screen glowing with proof. The ripple grew stronger now. The narrative was shifting. Rebecca's authority was no longer absolute. The truth was escaping her control, spilling into the open where denial couldn't contain it. Captain Harold Green appeared once more from the cockpit. His presence was calm but commanding, the way only a captain's could be. He addressed the cabin, his deep voice cutting through the tension. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to assure you that this flight is under control. Mr. Carter is seated in the place that was assigned to him. There is no issue with his ticket. We will continue as planned." It was official now, spoken by the highest authority on the plane. The confirmation Rebecca had resisted giving. Jonathan exhaled slowly, his chest easing slightly, yet even as relief brushed against him, he felt the weight of something else, the knowledge that this wasn't just about him anymore. The whole cabin was watching. Phones were capturing every second. Whatever this became, it would spread beyond the walls of this aircraft. Rebecca lingered near the galley, her face flushed, her movements jerky. Her authority had been undercut, and she knew it. But Jonathan also knew something else. People like her rarely surrendered gracefully. There would be more resistance, more attempts to twist the story. He leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. His mind drifted again to Leah. He could picture her phone lighting up with notifications, her friends sending her videos before he even landed. He hated the thought of her seeing him humiliated, of her watching her father's dignity challenged yet again. But maybe this time, she would see something else. Not humiliation, not silence, but defiance. The seatbelt sign dinged. Service resumed. But the energy in the cabin was different now. Passengers were no longer pretending not to notice. They had chosen sides, whether openly or silently. Some glared at Rebecca as she passed. Others nodded subtly in Jonathan's direction. The balance of power had shifted. Edward leaned forward once more, his voice lower now, stripped of confidence. "You know this is going to blow up. Right all over the internet? They'll twist it. They always do." Jonathan looked at him, calm as ever. "They won't need to twist it. The truth is enough." Edward swallowed hard, his words dying in his throat. Jonathan turned his gaze back to the window, the vast expanse of clouds stretching endlessly outside. He thought again of his father's words. "Walk in like you own it, even when they say you don't." Today, he wasn't just walking in, he was standing, and the cabin, the cameras, the witnesses, whether they liked it or not, were standing with him. For the first time since the confrontation began, Jonathan felt something stir beneath the anger and exhaustion, a flicker of possibility. Perhaps this moment, humiliating as it was, could become something more. The shift had begun, and he knew, deep down, it would not stop here. The aircraft cruised smoothly above the clouds, its engines a steady drone. But inside the cabin, the air was far from calm. Every row buzzed with low whispers, The glow of screens, the furtive movements of thumbs flying across phones. Jonathan Carter didn't need to look to know what was happening. The story had already escaped. He shifted slightly in seat 2A, glancing toward the aisle. 2 rows back, the young man with glasses hunched over his phone, uploading the boarding video he had recorded. Across the cabin, another passenger whispered into her device, eyes darting nervously between Jonathan and Rebecca. A ripple of digital energy spread through the plane like wildfire. Jonathan exhaled slowly. He had lived long enough to know how fast these things traveled. By the time the wheels touched the runway in Los Angeles, the narrative would already be unfolding, online videos cut, captions added, opinions flooding in. He wasn't just Jonathan Carter anymore. He was becoming something else. A story, a symbol. That realization pressed heavily on his chest. He didn't want to be a headline. He wanted to get to Los Angeles, deliver his presentation, close the deal that would secure the next chapter of his company. But dignity had collided with duty, and duty always won. Rebecca Miles knew it too. She could see the phones, the way people avoided her gaze now. She could feel her authority shrinking with every whisper, every nod in Jonathan's direction. And the weight of her loss of control twisted her smile into something brittle. She marched back down the aisle, stopping sharply at Jonathan's row. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice loud enough to carry to half the cabin. "If you continue creating a disturbance, I'll be forced to file a report with the FAA. That will have serious consequences." Her words were calculated. Threats cloaked in procedure. The kind of warning that could turn an inconvenience into a permanent mark against his name. Jonathan looked up at her, calm but unwavering. "A disturbance," he said evenly. "I've sat here quietly. The only disturbance has been your refusal to acknowledge the truth." Rebecca's cheeks flushed crimson. "You raised your voice earlier." "Yes," Jonathan replied, "because I was forced to, because silence would have meant surrendering my dignity. Is that what you expect?" A hush fell again. Passengers leaned closer, phones angled higher. They knew they were witnessing something larger than an argument over a seat. They were witnessing a battle of narratives, authority versus truth, procedure versus dignity. Edward Grant muttered something under his breath, shaking his head, but this time no one joined him. Even his wife tugged at his sleeve, urging him to stay quiet. From the back, Alicia Brown stepped forward again. Her voice was clear, carrying enough to reach the nearby rows. "Captain Green already confirmed Mr. Carter's seat is valid. There's no disturbance here, except what's being created by questioning him again." Rebecca spun toward her, fury flashing in her eyes. "This isn't your place." "Alicia?" Alicia's shoulders straightened. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice didn't waver. "It is my place, because I work on this plane too, and I won't stay silent while a passenger is treated unfairly." A ripple of approval swept through the rows. A few passengers even clapped softly, though the sound died quickly under the tension. Rebecca's face tightened. Her authority, already crumbling, slipped further. She turned on her heel and disappeared into the galley. Jonathan sat back, exhaling slowly. His gratitude for Alicia was immense, though he didn't say it aloud. Instead, he let his thoughts drift to Leah again. He pictured her sitting in her small apartment, surrounded by medical textbooks, her phone buzzing with the very videos now flooding the internet. He hated the thought of her worrying, but maybe she would see strength in his defiance. He pulled his phone from his pocket, glanced at the screen. Even in airplane mode, notifications queued silently at the top. Messages waiting, news alerts forming. His name would be attached to this before long. For a moment, doubt surged. Would this overshadow the meeting? Would investors see him as a risk, a distraction? Would his company's future be jeopardized because he chose to speak instead of staying silent? But then another thought cut through, sharp and undeniable. What future was worth building if he had to buy it with silence? Captain Harold Green reappeared briefly, moving toward the galley. He paused at Jonathan's row, his voice low, meant only for him. "You handled yourself well," he said. "Don't let them twist this." Jonathan gave a small nod. "Thank you, Captain." Green's eyes were steady, carrying the weight of someone who had lived through his own battles, long before camera phones turned every incident into evidence. Then he moved on, disappearing behind the curtain. The rest of the cabin shifted back into routine. But it was an uneasy routine. Drinks were poured, meals served, but the air never lightened. Passengers spoke in hushed tones, their eyes flicking between Jonathan and their screens. Everyone knew what was happening. The story had already gone public. Hours passed. But for Jonathan, time felt strange, both stretched and compressed. His mind raced with possibilities, outcomes, strategies. He drafted notes quietly on his phone, preparing for calls he would need to make the moment they landed. At one point, Alicia returned, offering him a fresh glass of water. "You okay?" she whispered. Jonathan met her eyes, and for the first time since boarding, he allowed himself a small, weary smile. "I will be," she nodded, understanding more than he said, then moved on. By the time the captain announced their descent into Los Angeles, the cabin felt like a stage after a play. Everyone had seen the drama. Everyone knew the lines, but no one quite knew how to return to normal. Jonathan tightened his seatbelt, gazing out at the coastline below. He knew what awaited him when the wheels touched down. Cameras, questions, scrutiny. The private humiliation had become a public spectacle, and yet, beneath the exhaustion, beneath the simmering anger, he felt something else rising inside him. Resolve. He whispered the word softly, almost to himself. From struggle comes purpose, and with that, he prepared not just to land, but to step into whatever storm awaited beyond the runway. The wheels touched the runway with a low rumble, the familiar jolt pulling Jonathan back from his thoughts. He had been staring out at the glittering sprawl of Los Angeles, watching the city lights spread across the dark horizon like a constellation flipped upside down. Now the tires screeched, brakes pressed, engines roared in reverse, and the cabin jolted forward. For most passengers, the sound meant arrival. For Jonathan Carter, it meant impact of a different kind. He knew the moment those doors opened, nothing would be the same. The intercom chimed. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Los Angeles International Airport," Captain Green announced. "Local time is 6:42 p.m. Please remain seated until we reach the gate." His voice was calm, steady, reassuring. But Jonathan caught something beneath the tone, a slight weight, as if the captain also knew this flight's landing would carry consequences beyond a safe arrival. As the plane taxied, Jonathan pulled his phone from his jacket pocket. He flicked it out of airplane mode. In an instant, the device exploded, hundreds of notifications flooding the screen, the vibrations continuous, overwhelming. His name, his company. Headlines already forming, short clips of the confrontation bouncing across social feeds, hashtags trending, first class while black, next core CEO, flight fight. Jonathan's stomach tightened. He scrolled quickly, scanning. The boarding video was already on 3 major news accounts. Another passenger had uploaded the confrontation where he challenged Rebecca in front of the cabin. Thousands of likes, thousands of comments, some messages of support, others drenched in venom. He turned off the screen, slipping the phone back into his pocket. He couldn't absorb it yet. Not here. Not surrounded by strangers with cameras still pointed his way. The seatbelt sign dinged off. Passengers rose, pulling bags from overhead compartments, their voices hushed, tentative. Some glanced at him with sympathy. Others avoided his eyes altogether, eager to escape the discomfort of what they had witnessed. Edward Grant shuffled in the aisle, avoiding Jonathan's gaze for once. His earlier confidence had dissolved into silence. His wife gripped his arm, whispering sharply at him to keep moving. Rebecca Miles lingered near the front galley, her face pale but her posture stiff. She avoided looking at Jonathan, speaking instead in clipped tones to another crew member. Her hands fidgeted with the stack of landing cards, knuckles white against the paper. Jonathan remained seated until the first wave of passengers began shuffling toward the exit. He preferred it this way. He didn't need to be the first out. He needed a moment to gather himself. Alicia Brown stopped briefly at his row. Her voice was low, her eyes steady. "There'll be people waiting out there," she said quietly. "Be ready." Jonathan met her gaze, the exhaustion clear in his own eyes. "Thank you," he said simply. Alicia gave a small nod, then moved on, her figure swallowed by the stream of passengers. When Jonathan finally stood, pulling his carry-on from the overhead, he felt the weight of every step toward the front. Phones still recorded. Passengers still whispered. His composure was a mask, but one he wore with practiced ease. At the door, Captain Green extended his hand. "Mr. Carter," he said firmly, "I hope the rest of your journey goes better than this one." Jonathan shook his hand, the quiet strength of the gesture saying more than words. "Thank you, Captain." Then he stepped into the jet bridge. The air was cooler here, sterile with the scent of circulating fans, but it wasn't empty. 2 men in dark suits stood waiting, their badges clipped to their belts. Airline representatives. "Mr. Carter," one of them asked. His voice was smooth, overly polite. "Could we have a word before you proceed to baggage claim?" Jonathan studied them briefly. They carried the look of damage control expensive suits, forced smiles, the urgency of men whose job was to contain fires before they reached corporate headquarters. "I have a meeting," Jonathan replied evenly. "If you have something to say it quickly." The taller man cleared his throat. "We want to extend our sincerest apologies for the inconvenience you experienced on board. Please understand it was a miscommunication, not reflective of our values as an airline." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "A miscommunication? That's the phrase you're going with." The man's smile faltered. "Well, Mr. Carter, these situations can sometimes appear different than they truly are. What matters is resolving it amicably." Jonathan stepped closer, lowering his voice. "What matters," he said, "is that one of your employees repeatedly questioned my right to sit in a seat I purchased, in front of witnesses, on camera, and now the world is watching." The second man shifted uncomfortably. "We'd like to offer you a gesture of goodwill. Complimentary flights, upgrades. We can discuss settlement terms privately." Jonathan almost laughed. "Settlement." Silence. The oldest tools in the corporate playbook. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice razor-sharp but quiet, "you think you can buy my silence with a first-class voucher. This isn't about perks. This is about systemic failure. And I assure you, this conversation won't stay private." The taller man opened his mouth, but Jonathan stepped past them, his carry-on rolling behind him. He had no interest in their scripted apologies. Not tonight. As he emerged into the terminal, the impact of reality struck. Reporters stood near the gate exit, cameras flashing, microphones extended. Passengers spilled around them, but the focus was unmistakable. Jonathan Carter had become the story. Mr. Carter, did the airline deny your seat because of your race? Mr. Carter, will you be suing Mr. Carter? Do you plan to comment publicly? The barrage was immediate, relentless. Jonathan paused only long enough to look directly into one of the cameras. His face calm, his voice steady. He spoke a single sentence. The truth is already out there. Then he walked forward, his stride deliberate, his composure unshaken. The cameras followed. Reporters shouted. But he didn't break stride. He had a car waiting, a meeting ahead, and decisions to make. As he reached the curb, his phone buzzed again. A call from Diane, his longtime assistant. He answered. "Jonathan," she said breathlessly, "it's everywhere. CNN, Bloomberg, Twitter. Everyone's covering it. Western Financial CEO just called. They still want the meeting, but they've moved it up. They want to hear your thoughts on accountability immediately." Jonathan tightened his grip on the phone. The incident wasn't just viral. It was reshaping the context of his business in real time. "I'll be there," he said, "and Diane have the team pull every discrimination case against major airlines from the last 5 years. Patterns, numbers, settlements. I want all of it." "You're pivoting?" Diane asked. Jonathan's gaze swept across the sea of flashing cameras outside the terminal. He thought of Rebecca's words, Edward's mutters, Alicia's quiet courage. He thought of Leah's face when she would see the videos. "No," he said firmly. "I'm expanding." And with that, Jonathan stepped into the waiting car, the door closing behind him. Outside, the cameras kept flashing. But inside, Jonathan Carter's resolve had already moved beyond survival. He was preparing for transformation. Los Angeles at night pulsed with neon and urgency. From the back seat of the black sedan, Jonathan Carter watched the city flash by in streaks of red taillights and towering billboards. His phone buzzed constantly, but he ignored most of it, focusing instead on the document glowing on his tablet. Western Financial's headquarters rose ahead, a steel and glass monument to wealth and power. Normally, Jonathan would have centered his thoughts on numbers projections, cost savings, market advantages. Tonight, the math was still there, but something more powerful pressed against his chest. He wasn't just about to pitch a product. He was about to pitch accountability itself. Diane waited in the lobby when he arrived, her suit immaculate, her expression taut with the strain of a day spent fielding calls. She handed him a fresh packet of documents. "These are the case studies you asked for. Airline complaints. 5-year span. It's worse than we thought." Jonathan flipped through the pages as they rode the elevator upward. Graphs, numbers, reports of incidents that mirrored his own. Dozens, then hundreds, patterns so obvious they screamed off the page. "Perfect," he murmured. "This is exactly what I need." The boardroom was full when he entered. 12 executives sat around the glossy oak table, their eyes a blend of curiosity, calculation, and unease. At the head sat William Harper, Western CEO, his silver hair gleaming under recessed lights, his hands folded neatly before him. "Mr. Carter," Harper said, standing to shake his hand. "Quite a day for you." Jonathan met his grip with steady strength. "Quite a day for all of us." Polite smiles flickered around the table. Everyone had seen the clips. Everyone knew why they were here. Jonathan didn't waste time. He connected his tablet to the screen. the next core logo dissolving into a clean, bold phrase. Accountability metrics now. The room shifted back, straightening, pen stilled. Western Financial approached NextCore for security solutions, Jonathan began, his voice steady but charged with energy. You wanted protection from digital threats, from hackers and breaches, but today, you and the entire world witnessed another kind of breach, a breach of trust, a breach of dignity, a breach that cost companies just as much as stolen data. He tapped the screen. Graphs appeared, showing airline settlements, lawsuits, PR crises tied to discrimination. Over 5 years, the airline industry has logged over 3,000 racial discrimination complaints, most dismissed as isolated. Yet patterns emerge, patterns ignored until a camera phone captures them. By then, it's too late. Value evaporates, stock prices fall, trust collapses. The room was silent. Some executives scribbled notes. Others simply stared, absorbing. Jonathan continued, NextCore's platform is designed to detect anomalies in financial systems. But what if we expand that lens? What if we apply the same algorithms to corporate behavior to identify discrimination, harassment, systemic bias before it erupts into a headline, before it costs billions? The words landed with weight. Jonathan felt the shift, the lean of the room toward him. Western's CFO, a sharp-featured woman with eyes like steel, spoke first. You're talking about turning your software into an accountability monitor, a risk management tool for reputation. Jonathan nodded. Exactly. Because accountability is security. If your culture fails, your numbers fail, and the market punishes you. He advanced the slides again. Charts showed cost projections, savings from avoided lawsuits, simulations of reputational risk management. Then footage appeared, clips from that very day, captured on passengers' phones. Rebecca's dismissive tone, Jonathan's steady rebuttal, Alicia's courageous support. A collective intake of breath swept the table. The footage wasn't just numbers now. It was human, real. Jonathan let the silence hang for a beat before speaking. That's what systemic failure looks like. It's not about one gate agent, one flight attendant. It's about patterns ignored until they explode. My company can quantify those patterns, and with your partnership, we can lead the way in fixing them. The chief risk officer leaned forward, frowning but intrigued. Do you mean you want Western Financial to be your test case? Jonathan met his gaze. I want Western to be the first institution that proves accountability can be measured, managed, and monetized. I want Western to lead. The CEO's eyes narrowed slightly. He was calculating. Jonathan knew balancing cost, benefit, public perception. Finally, Harper leaned back in his chair. Mr. Carter, your timing is remarkable. The entire country is watching you tonight. If we align with you, we tie ourselves to your story. If we don't, we risk being seen as indifferent. Either way, this is no longer just about cybersecurity. Jonathan allowed himself the faintest smile. That's exactly the point. The room buzzed again as questions spilled technical, financial, ethical. Jonathan answered each with precision, weaving data with conviction. He could feel momentum building, a tide he hadn't planned, but now rode with certainty. At last. Harper raised a hand for silence. We'll need to deliberate, but I'll be candid. Mr. Carter, what you've presented isn't just compelling, it's necessary, and the world will expect us to act quickly. Jonathan nodded, closing his tablet. Then let's not keep the world waiting. The meeting adjourned with murmurs of agreement, handshakes exchanged, promises of follow-up. Jonathan left the boardroom with Diane at his side. Her face glowed with quiet pride. You turned their fear into vision, she whispered. Jonathan exhaled deeply. Now we see if they're willing to buy it. As they rode the elevator down, Jonathan's phone buzzed again, this time a news alert. Continental Airlines stock had dropped 7% since boarding. Calls for boycott surged online. The CEO's name was trending alongside his own. Diane glanced at the screen. They're panicking. Jonathan stared at the numbers, his jaw tightening. Good. Maybe it's time they felt the cost. Outside. The night air was cool, the city lights shimmering like reflections of the storm he had just unleashed. Jonathan paused on the curb, looking up at the sky where planes traced glowing arcs across the darkness. He thought of his father, of Leah, of every quiet humiliation swallowed over the years. Tonight, none of it was invisible anymore. Tonight, the storm was public, and Jonathan Carter was no longer just caught in it, he was steering it. Morning broke over Los Angeles, the sky streaked in pale gold and soft blue. Jonathan Carter hadn't slept more than 2 hours. He had spent most of the night on the phone with Diane, his legal team, and investors who wanted answers about the viral storm that refused to die down. Now, as he stood in the conference room of his downtown hotel, the Fairmont, sunlight spilling across the long table, he felt both exhausted and electrified. His company's communications team had transformed the room overnight. Banners lined the walls with a new logo, Accountability Now. Screens displayed graphs and key messages. Cameras were already being set up by the press. Jonathan tightened his burgundy tie. Leah's gift years ago, and looked at himself in the glass window. His reflection carried tired eyes, but also resolve. This was no longer about a seat on a plane. It was about forcing institutions to answer for what they preferred to bury. Diane entered briskly. "They're here," she said softly. Jonathan turned. "Continental." She nodded. "Interim CEO. Their general counsel. PR director. They want a private conversation before the press arrives." Jonathan's jaw tightened. Private conversations are how they bury things. Not today. Diane hesitated. "Jonathan, if you confront them in public, it'll be war." He adjusted his cufflinks, the ones that once belonged to his father. Then let it be war. Minutes later, the door opened. Amanda Rivera entered first, flanked by a pair of suits. She was in her early 50s, Latina, sharp-eyed, carrying herself with the composure of someone who had been thrust into crisis leadership overnight. "Mr. Carter," she said, extending her hand. "Thank you for seeing us." Jonathan studied her, then shook firmly. "You don't have much of a choice right now." Rivera's lips pressed into a thin line. "You're right, which is why we'd like to resolve this quickly. Discreetly." Jonathan gestured to the documents spread across the table. "There's nothing discreet about what happened. The world saw it." Her general counsel leaned forward. "Mr. Carter, the airline regrets your experience. We are prepared to issue a personal apology, as well as discuss a financial settlement. We'd prefer to avoid litigation or further public escalation." Jonathan gave a short laugh, devoid of humor. "Litigation. You still think this is about money? You haven't been listening." The PR director, a younger man with nervous eyes, interjected. "Public sentiment is shifting quickly. We've already lost 8% in stock value. If we make a strong joint statement with you, perhaps highlighting your company's work and accountability, we can turn the narrative, show the world we're serious." Jonathan's gaze hardened. "You're serious because your stock dropped, not because you care about the people you humiliate every day. Let's not pretend otherwise." Silence followed, thick and uncomfortable. Rivera finally spoke, her voice quieter but firmer. "What do you want?" "Mr. Carter." Jonathan leaned forward, his voice steady, deliberate. "I want systemic change, not hush money, not empty apologies. I want your airline to adopt accountability metrics. I want every complaint logged, tracked, analyzed. I want repeat offenders flagged before they ruin lives. And I want the public to see that data. Transparency, not spin." The General Counsel frowned. That level of transparency would expose us legally. The liability. "The liability already exists," Jonathan cut in. "You've just been hiding it. Yesterday, your employee turned me into a symbol of everything broken in your culture. Today, you have a choice. Fix it, or I'll make sure you're remembered as the company that refused." Rivera held his gaze for a long moment. She saw the conviction there, the unwillingness to bend. She also saw the storm outside media vans lining the street, cameras waiting, hashtags still climbing. Finally, she nodded slowly. "We'll implement your system. On one condition, we announce it together." Jonathan's expression didn't shift. "We'll announce it at my press conference, in front of the world. If you want to stand on that stage, you stand behind me." Rivera exhaled. She wasn't used to negotiating from weakness, but this was no ordinary moment. "Then we'll see you at 9. The Continental team left, their faces tight with reluctant resolve. Diane stepped closer once they were gone. "You realize what you just did?" Jonathan turned back to the window, watching the morning light rise higher over the city. "I gave them a chance to evolve. And if they don't, I'll make sure everyone sees it." At 9 o'clock sharp, the press conference began. The room was packed with reporters, cameras, even live streamers jostling for angles. Jonathan stepped to the podium, adjusting the microphone. Flashes erupted, voices hushed. "Yesterday," he began, his voice carrying the quiet weight of truth, "I was told my kind didn't belong in first class. I was denied a seat I had purchased. I was humiliated in front of strangers for no reason but the color of my skin. Many of you saw the videos. Many of you shared them. But this isn't about one flight or one airline. This is about the countless stories that never go viral. The thousands of passengers, employees, citizens who face discrimination in silence." He paused, letting the words breathe, the silence thick with tension. "That ends today. NextCore is launching Accountability Now, a platform designed to track, analyze, and expose systemic bias in corporations. Discrimination isn't just immoral, it's costly. It destroys trust. It erodes brands. It ends careers. And now, it will no longer be hidden." Gas rippled through the crowd as the screen lit up behind him, displaying charts, case studies, and statistics. Jonathan's voice sharpened, each word deliberate. "Continental Airlines has agreed to be among the first adopters of this platform. Their interim CEO, Amanda Rivera, is here today. She will speak to their commitment to change." The cameras swung as Rivera approached the podium. Her voice was careful, but resolute. "On behalf of Continental Airlines, I want to apologize to Mr. Carter and to all passengers who have experienced discrimination in our care. We failed. And failure demands accountability. That's why, starting today, we are partnering with NextCore to implement systems that will ensure transparency in how we handle complaints and customer treatment." The room erupted, questions shouted, flashes blinding. Jonathan watched her, noting the unease under her poise, but also the reality the words had been spoken, publicly, irreversibly. When the press conference ended, Jonathan stepped away from the podium, exhaustion settling in his bones. But beneath it was something else, vindication. He had forced a corporation to its knees not for himself alone, but for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. In the corner, Diane approached with her phone. "Jonathan," she said, eyes wide. "The stock market just reacted. Continental's drop slowed. Next core is up 15%. Jonathan allowed himself a small, weary smile. "Good. That's the price of truth." As he left the room, the roar of reporters still echoing behind him, Jonathan Carter knew this was no longer just a story about humiliation at a gate. It was the reckoning corporations had been running from for years. The conference room had emptied hours ago, but Jonathan Carter still stood at the window, staring out over Los Angeles as twilight bled into night. The roar of reporters, the flash of cameras, the endless questions, it had all dissolved into silence now. Yet inside him, the storm still churned. He loosened his tie and exhaled, letting fatigue sink into his bones. His phone buzzed relentlessly on the table behind him, a steady stream of messages from journalists, investors, activists. But one message caught his eye, a simple text that had come in minutes earlier. From Leia. "Proud of you? Dad. Call me." Jonathan smiled for the first time all day. He picked up the phone, hit dial, and listened to the rings until her voice broke through. "Dad." Her tone was both anxious and bursting with pride. "I'm here," Jonathan said softly. "You're everywhere," she replied, a small laugh breaking through. "You're all over the news. My classmates stopped lecture to watch the live stream. Everyone's talking about you." Jonathan sank into the nearest chair, rubbing his forehead. "I didn't want to be the story. Leah, I just wanted to fly to Los Angeles, deliver a presentation, and go home." "I know," she said gently, "but maybe you were meant to be. You've always told me purpose finds us in the hardest moments. Maybe this was yours." Jonathan closed his eyes, remembering all the times he'd repeated those words to her when she came home in tears after classmates made fun of her hair, when teachers underestimated her, when the world felt like it was trying to shrink her spirit. Now his daughter was giving the words back to him. "I saw the clip of you speaking," Leah continued, "when you said, 'That ends today.' It gave me chills. Dad, you weren't just speaking for yourself. You were speaking for all of us." His throat tightened. He didn't trust himself to speak for a moment. "Finally," he said, "I just hope it makes a difference. Real difference, not just headlines." "It already has," Leah said. "Do you know how many people are sharing their own stories online right now? Thousands. You opened a door for them. And you didn't just demand change. You built something to make it possible. That's more than most people ever do." Jonathan let the silence stretch, absorbing her words. She was right. The foundation had been laid. Accountability. Now wasn't just a product pitch anymore. It was a movement waiting to grow. Later that week, Jonathan walked into NextCore's headquarters in Seattle. The building buzzed with unusual energy, employees clustered in hallways, news crews parked outside, job applicants lining up with resumes in hand. His company had become a symbol almost overnight. He gathered his leadership team in the auditorium, a space packed to standing room only with staff. When he stepped onto the stage, applause erupted, thunderous and sustained. Jonathan raised his hands gently for quiet. "When I started this company 20 years ago, I wanted to protect systems, to keep data safe, to keep institutions secure. But what I've learned, what we've all learned, is that the greatest breaches aren't just digital. They're human. They're cultural. They're the moments when dignity is denied and accountability disappears." The room was silent, hanging on every word. Last week, I was told my kind didn't belong in first class. But what that flight attendant didn't know was that first class isn't just a seat. It's a symbol of who belongs and who doesn't. And too often, that line is drawn along the color of our skin. His voice thickened, but his tone remained steady. I refused to step aside, not just for myself, but for everyone who's ever been told to move back, to stay quiet, to accept less. And now, with accountability now, we're giving companies a choice: evolve or be exposed. Applause thundered again, but Jonathan wasn't finished. That's why today, I'm announcing the next core accountability foundation. With a $20 million endowment, we will provide free access to our tools for civil rights organizations. We will support research into the economic cost of discrimination, and we will fund opportunities for underrepresented youth to enter fields that have long shut them out. The room erupted again, louder than before. Employees rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, some even wiping tears. Jonathan glanced toward the front row, where Captain Harold Green sat quietly. The retired pilot had agreed to join the Foundation's advisory board, lending his decades of experience and his credibility to the mission. Their eyes met, a silent exchange of respect between men who had both carried invisible burdens in the skies. In the days that followed, the momentum only grew. Western Financial formally signed the largest contract in NextCore's history, $70 million, to implement the Accountability Now platform across their systems. Continental Airlines announced sweeping reforms, firing repeat offenders and pledging transparency. Other corporations called, desperate to align, before they became the next viral headline. For Jonathan, the whirlwind was surreal. He appeared on morning shows, testified before congressional committees, met with civil rights leaders who had long dreamed of such tools. Every time he stood behind a podium, he thought of Leah, of the young woman studying medicine, carrying both his blood and his fight. One evening, after another marathon day of meetings, Jonathan finally sat down alone in his office. On his desk sat a framed copy of Leah's text from that first night. "Proud of you, Dad. Purpose finds us." He stared at it for a long time, letting the noise of the world fade in that quiet. He thought of his father, a man who never lived to see him succeed. He thought of the humiliations swallowed over decades, of the stereotypes he had sidestepped with forced patience, of the toll it had taken to stay calm in rooms where anger would have been weaponized against him. And for the first time, he felt something like peace, because the struggle hadn't been in vain. It had become purpose, and purpose, he knew, was contagious. The next morning, as Jonathan boarded yet another plane, this time greeted warmly by the crew, passengers nodding in recognition, he felt the eyes again. But they weren't measuring him with suspicion. They were measuring him with respect. He settled into seat 2A, the same number that had once been denied to him. He fastened his seatbelt, exhaled, and allowed himself a rare smile. The flight attendant leaned closer. "Mr. Carter," she said softly. "Thank you. For all of us." Jonathan looked out the window as the engines roared to life. Clouds stretched endless across the horizon, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't just feel like a passenger. He felt like a pilot. Jonathan Carter's story reminds us of a truth too many already know. Discrimination doesn't disappear with success, no matter the titles, the wealth, or the achievements. Bias has a way of showing up in airports, in workplaces, in daily life. But this time, the script was flipped. One man turned humiliation into accountability, personal pain into systemic change. He refused to stay silent, and in doing so, He gave voice to thousands whose stories never make the news. It's not just about Jonathan, or even about an airline. It's about every person who's ever been told they don't belong, every soul carrying the weight of prejudice in silence. And it's about the hope that, when exposed, injustice can no longer hide in the shadows. As you let this story settle, ask yourself, what would you do in his place? Would you let it go, or would you demand change? If Jonathan's courage moved you, if his fight inspired you, make sure to like this video, share it with those who need to hear it, and subscribe to our channel. Because more stories like this are coming, and together, we can shine a light where others try to keep the world in the dark.